first real international meeting of diplomacy between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will take place on Tuesday, as it is a crucial visit for the war in Israel, the ceasefire, but also Netanyahu himself. I do want to put up a post here from the Washington Post talking about the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is the first foreign leader invited to the White House under President Trump, and the two will need to work out how to advance the Gaza ceasefire. As we've seen, hostages being returned, so some big news in terms of that. Steve Witkoff at the forefront of that in the Trump administration. All right, let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox as we bring into the conversation right now President and CEO of JINSA, Michael Makovsky. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And there are so many interesting aspects of this. How important was it for President Trump to invite Netanyahu, and how maybe monumental is it that he's the first foreign leader to visit the White House in his second term?
Hi, nice to see you. Thanks for having me. I think that I commend President Trump for doing it, because I think it's very significant. Indeed, it's a real show of support that he had that he has Prime Minister Netanyahu as the first foreign leader to visit him in the White House in this term. I think it's a contrast to President Biden, I may add, who did not have who didn't have Prime Minister Netanyahu, who didn't even meet Netanyahu, I think, for about 9 months, and they met in New York after Netanyahu was just elected prime minister. So I think off the bat, it shows it's a very important signal, not just to Israel, but obviously to Iran, to our friends and to our allies, but particularly I think to Iran, that in this administration, the United States is going to be very supportive of Israel.
Yeah, and we'll get into that aspect, because it is an overarching theme to all of these conflicts there in that region in the Middle East. But I want to talk to you about how crucial it is for Netanyahu himself to remain in power. What do you make of this, and is there a possibility that Netanyahu won't be in power soon?
I don't think a lot of people have made a lot of money over the years betting against Netanyahu staying in power. Yeah. So I certainly wouldn't put, I wouldn't put any money on that. I think he's going to stay in power. He doesn't have to have new elections for a couple of years. Now, his coalition is fragile, and he has an important coalition partner who's threatened to leave if he continues with this ceasefire deal in Gaza. But I think he'll manage to stay in power.
And I want to ask you in the context of this meeting with Trump, because he is obviously thinking about that, wanting to remain in power, wanting to be remaining the leader there in Israel. What goes in terms of that? What kind of deal, what kind of conversation leads to him remaining in power?
Well, first of all, I think the most important thing, and this answers your question, but I think the most important agenda item for him, for Netanyahu, is Iran. That is the most, I know the press is obviously very focused on the Gaza deal. It's very important for a number of reasons. And obviously, as we just said, has political implications for Netanyahu. But I think Netanyahu's been very focused for decades on the Iranian threat. This is now the moment to really address that nuclear threat, as the Iranians are dangerously close to a nuclear bomb. That is item number one. And I'd say 2 and 3. I think for Netanyahu is really having an understanding with President Trump about how this is going to play out, what Israel wants to do to see what kind of help the United States will supply him. And I think if he successfully navigates that, that would be all the political support I think Netanyahu needs.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, it is the priority in a big way for Israel, and then as you juxtapose that for the United States. I do want to ask you about Iran, because we talk about it and a possibility for discussions with the United States, with Iran, potentially Israel involved. Do you think there will be discussions in Washington, D.C. tomorrow about that, about talks with Iran?
Yes. So I think Netanyahu will try to discourage President Trump from conducting talks with the Iranians. I think he'll try to communicate to him that to Trump that you're a great negotiator, Mr. President, but the Iranians are pretty masters themselves in this. All they do with every negotiation is drag it out. And I think the situation is so close right now that they're going to achieve nuclear weapons capability that we don't want to waste time really on endless talks, which I think are a trap. It's an Iranian trap. Now, I think Trump is going to want to pursue that. So then I think Netanyahu is going to try to convince President Trump to keep it as time limited talks with very strict conditions. I think that will be the next thing. I think otherwise, I think Netanyahu is going to he's going to explain that Israel now has a great moment. So does the United States to really initiate a military attack on Iran's nuclear facilities based on all the successes that Israel's had in recent months of pretty much decapitating Hezbollah, removing that as a major threat, and also removing the important air defenses of Iran so that the nuclear facilities are more exposed for now. So I think he's going to try to see if President Trump will help, will work with Israel, will collaborate in such a campaign. And if they're not, to at a minimum, I think, give Israel the weapons it needs and maybe some support, as I think Israel will explain, that Netanyahu will explain that Israel's going to have no choice but to conduct such an attack, I think, this year.
All right, very interesting. And like you mentioned with Iran, the possibility of a nuclear weapon is also something that they're going to talk about in a significant way, like you mentioned. How big of a component is that? You mentioned Iran being the top priority. Is that 1A amongst the conversation about Iran?
Yeah, I think it's really the nuclear program with Iran. That's it. I mean, there's obviously and we could talk about it. Obviously, Gaza ceasefire is going to be another important discussion. But I think topic number one, it's the nuclear program and those items I mentioned to see about the talks to discourage U.S. Pursuing such talks and seeing what help they could get from the United States in such an attack, I think.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all goes down in terms of Israel, in terms of President Trump here in the United States. And like you mentioned, President Trump will likely maybe try to get involved in conversations there. Let's go back to Israel and the ongoing ceasefire that continues on. We mentioned the fact that there are some political implications to this meeting as well. A post here from the New York Post saying Israel's Netanyahu heads to the U.S. to discuss the victory over Hamas with Trump. And there are plenty of people in Israel that still want to wipe Hamas off. Do you think after the ceasefire wraps up that they will resume that war?
Yeah. Oh, if I get one more thing on Iran, I'll just say that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu will remind President Trump how the Iranians have tried to assassinate President Trump over the last year. And I'm sure he's going to remind him that at least once, if not more so during that conversation. On Gaza, I think that it's very important Netanyahu to ensure that he achieves his objective, that Hamas does not rule Gaza. So he's in a bind because on the one hand, he wants to get the rest of the hostages back. On the other hand, to get those back, you might have to commit to stopping the war. So I don't know how it's going to play out, honestly. But I do think whatever it plays out, whether Netanyahu commits, as long as Hamas observes its side to fully execute this deal, the ceasefire deal, I think Israel will eventually see its way back because they can't permit what we've seen on TV with Hamas, with these parades with these hostages and intimidating these American and Israeli hostages. Israel can't permit that. It can't permit Hamas to rebuild and become a threat. So there has to be some arrangement. But I think there'll be some conversation about something that President Trump has said now, I think about 3 times now, that, Gaza is, pretty much it's a lot of rubble there. Maybe they could move out some of the Palestinians, move them to Gaza, move them to Egypt. I don't think moving them to Jordan, not Gaza, move them to Jordan and move them to Egypt. I don't think moving to Jordan is very realistic, but there might be an arrangement. The Egyptians are against this, but maybe some temporary movement. At least this is what Trump has talked about, moving him into Sinai, and that will be a conversation. It's unclear how this is going to all interface. By the way, they're also going to talk about normalization with the Saudis, and that's related to this because if you don't mind my jumping ahead,
Go for it.
but I think that this is a priority for President Trump to continue the Abraham's Accord, that historic achievement of his in 2020. The question is, do you need some quiet in Gaza to do that? Because that will enable the Saudis to make a normalization agreement with Israel. So these are the different things they got to choreograph.
Yeah.
And it's not simple. It's not simple. But I think to answer your question very clearly, I think Israel, if they agree to the ceasefire, continue finishing it, they're going to have to come back and ensure that Hamas doesn't control that strip.
Yeah, you mentioned it. The choreography of all of this is so very delicate with so many different actors and players in this region. And now President Trump back inside the White House, another actor there that a lot of different options are on the table, and a lot will be said at this meeting tomorrow in Washington, D.C. at the White House between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Trump. All right, Michael, thank you so much. I appreciate your insight, as always, here on Live Now from Fox. Thanks again.